What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. Today, returning to the podcast is practical theologian at Luther Seminary, Andrew Root. That's right, Andy is on here, and we are talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his experiment in theological education. He was serving two German churches in London, and as the confessing church and its resistance to Hitler grew and the tensions within the larger church got bigger, they decided to create a number of seminaries that are detached from the traditional part of the German church, a part of the church that had been seized by kind of the Nazi energy and movement. And they called Bonhoeffer to start this seminary at Finkenwalde. And there he has this experiment in communal living, a Lutheran, a Protestant, a very Lutheran guy, exploring what is it like to do theological education at a time where the church is facing a crisis of integrity, a call to serve ultimately Hitler, serve an ideology of death. And he thought there's something to learn from intentional communities. There's something to learn from the monastic tradition. There's something to learn from those within the church that take the Sermon on the Mount as a call to discipleship. And it's there at Finkenwalde. He writes Cost of Discipleship and A Life Together, two books that remain classics in Western spirituality. Anyway, Andrew and I get to talk about this, and it's a timely conversation. But before we hop in, no, he's also a part of a giant audio documentary series we're in the midst of releasing, The Rise of Bonhoeffer. If you go to bonhoefferpodcast.com, you'll be able to join right now. It's just like a normal podcast, except it's highly produced, and Jeffrey Pugh and I are bringing in a host of different Bonhoeffer scholars, including Andrew Root and Victoria Barnett and Reggie Williams and Jennifer McBride and Stephen Haynes and Michael DeYoung, and you get the idea. So go over there, check it out, bonhoefferpodcast.com. And if you want to hang out with Andrew and I this summer, in June, the end of June, do you want to go to Berlin, Germany, June 21st to 26th, and do a deep dive with Bonhoeffer? Well, Andrew, Root, Trip Fuller, together in Berlin at Bonhoeffer's house. That's right, the very house where Bonhoeffer was arrested is the house we're going to be discussing, learning about Bonhoeffer. We're going to be doing travel all around the city to different sites and places, museums. We're going to get to see some of his library. You'll get to sit at his desk. And anyway, it's going to be amazing. If you would like to come with a very small group, it's only going to be 20 of us, to Berlin this summer, June 21st to 26th, head over to bonhoeffertrip.com. Bonhoeffer Trip, but like a travel trip, not my name trip. My name trip is 2-piece. Travel trip is just 1P. All right? I think we already got like half of the trip is already sold. So if you're interested, go over there, sign up. Everything, all the details and stuff are there. But if you have questions, feel free to follow up with me. But yeah, looking forward to that, and looking forward to hanging out and reflecting on the life, faith of Bonhoeffer, the challenging questions of his time and our time. You'll see in this, Andy and I like talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and contemporary challenges of faith and the future of the church. And if you dig that and want to do it in Berlin at his house, go to beer gardens after, nerd out with your geek out with me, or and you can bring a friend. All right, you can do that. All right, it's permission granted. All right, here we go. Enjoy. All right, hello everyone. This is Trip. I'm here with Andrew Root, and we're gonna have some fun, Andy.
All right.
Because I like talking to you. You at least have convinced me you like talking to me, and we both like talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
We do. I do like talking to you, Trip, and about Bonhoeffer is always a pleasure.
Yeah. Which, if anyone enjoys this, and they say, "Whoa, I like talking about Bonhoeffer too," and I might even like talking with Andy and Trip about Bonhoeffer in Berlin, in Bonhoeffer's own house, they could go to bonhoeffertrip.com and come join us this summer in Berlin, spend the week going deep with Bonhoeffer in Bonhoeffer's house, having fun in Berlin. And the extrovert that sleeps less will continue said festivities at beer gardens in the evening. So yes. I'm pretty excited about that.
It's going to be fun. And there is a limited number of spots because Bonhoeffer's house, it's actually the family's downsized house, so it's and I'll take you to the neighborhood that he grew up in, and we'll look into the big house he grew up with his brothers and sisters. But this is the downsized house they moved in the early 1930s, right before the Olympics.
Mhm.
Yeah, the Olympics in Berlin. So, which is just one S-Bahn stop from the Olympic Stadium. So, yeah, there's all sorts of stuff to see in Berlin, and there's limited spots. You get about 20, 22 people in that house comfortably. And so, yeah, be one of those, and I'll hang out with you in the regular hours, and Trip will hang out with you in the regular hours and the late
Yeah.
hours too.
Yeah, we're just only obligating one of us for after 9 p.m.
Right. And will not be me.
And if you come and you're like, I don't want to have beverages until 11:30 or so, and then get up and nerd out at 8 a.m. You don't have to stay. I'm just saying.
No, you can follow me. I will lead you back the introvert time around, I don't know, 4:35, and then you can introvert.
So one of the things I think would be fun, or at least helpful to start off today, is the period of time in Bonhoeffer's life where he comes back from London, and that's where the confessing church is starting to have trouble. You're having a lack of backbone of sorts. The confessing church is being pressured in ways that it is no longer, having space because of the rise of the German Christian movement. And they decide that one of the things we need to do is actually have our own seminaries, and that the formation of church leaders that are going to serve congregations attempting to remain faithful amidst all that's going on, and that we need a kind of intentional community space for this formation. And Bonhoeffer is tasked with putting one of these together. Now, in that time period, we get this transition where early on, Bonhoeffer's response to all that's taking place is difficult for him as a German and a Lutheran because of the church-state relation. So it's like the church has some obligation for its witness to the state, to take care of the rights and needs that are promised to citizens and such. And he talks about that in Church and the Jewish Question, and then says, but there's a transition that takes place when you realize that the state is a tyrant, that it's a failed state. And now the obligation or job of the church is different. And you can see that transition taking place in this turn towards, let's attend to discipleship, let's attend to the ecclesia and what it looks like. And I wonder, like, how you see that transition as someone who obviously wrote a book on his time as a youth minister, right, which is earlier on in this period, and then thinking about what he's doing for theological education, the way he's seeing the needs of the church, that this experiment in life together is a result. So, like, how do you see this moment in his life and what's going on at Finkenwalde?
Yeah, well, I think you have to remember two things kind of lead up, at least into Bonhoeffer's experience of going to Finkenwalde. And the first is just a very busy time in the early 1930s. I mean, just his plate is full with so many things he's doing. He doesn't get enough, I don't know, credit or just conversation about the fact that his primary call, the position he's been ordained into, is chaplain at the Technical University, which is right by the hotel we'll stay at, pretty close by. That he's the chaplain there, and it doesn't go very well. Like, his ministry isn't working very well. But then he's doing all these other things on top of it. Like he's teaching at the university and writing those lectures that will become Christ the Center and will become Creation and Fall eventually. He's taking that out of control confirmation class over. And this is really the awakening of the political here. And I think it is really interesting in our own time to think about, how we resist, or when do we know to resist. It really is two things, I feel like, that lead Bonhoeffer into kind of taking this turn into a more political stance. And one is that there's going to be a church election. I mean, this is a state church, and there's going to be a church election, and it feels very corrupt the way that this church election is going to go. So that's one experience. I mean, it's directly how it impacts the church more than it's like, it has huge political, kind of larger societal political realities to it. But it's first and foremost how he as a minister of the church now has to respond to the way that this political regime is putting its hands within the ecclesial structure in trying to use it for its own gain. And then the second is really watching these kids in the wedding district of Berlin be beat up by brown shirt, SA people and Hitler Youth The street fighting is huge, and Dietrich is watching it. It's the way the Nazis take control of neighborhoods is they go in and they start fights, and it's an interesting political dynamic because then they tell people they're the only party that can stop the fighting on the street, even though they're always the ones who start it. You know what I mean? It's a very ingeniously diabolical way to win community support by starting fights and then being like, we're the only ones who can stop it. You can see the play book that happens here in certain kind of populist totalitarians, that they start problems and then they're the only ones who can save us from problems. So that reality, he goes to London because he's exhausted. His plate is just filled with all of these activities. And then he's in London. That's one of the fascinating things that we often forget is like the Barmen Confession is written, the Pastors Emergency League moves into the confessing church officially. And Bonhoeffer is kind of like the name of that, like it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Barmen Confession and the creation of the confessing church, but he wasn't there for it. He was in London as a pastor with his friend Hildebrand. They were co-pastoring. He had just kind of gotten away. And I think we need more analysis of what actually is going on there. But my sense is there's this kind of sense of exhaustion. There's a sense of needing to kind of lean into other pastoral concerns, but it ends up serving this huge purpose for him. I think broadly is it connects him deeper to George Bell, which is huge. And he's known George Bell through the ecumenical movement, but now they become even closer. And that's huge. But once he gets word that he will be one of these principals of one of these, I believe it's 5 legal seminaries, one of the other fascinating things that people need to write dissertations on is like, there's no ATS meeting on what the curriculum must be. As I understand it, he just gets word, will you take this? He's not 30 years old yet. He's in his late 20s, and they're like, you can do whatever you want. Like, yeah, whatever curriculum you want to do, you can do. That's really fascinating. So his decision is to make it really quite rigorous academically, because that's just who he is. PhD from in habilitation from the University of Berlin, from Humboldt. He's academic is going to be there, but he also thinks there needs to be this kind of contemplative spirituality. And so before he goes back, he's taken the position, but before he goes actually back to start leading this community at Finkenwalde, this seminary at Finkenwalde, he visits all these monasteries and kind of thinks about these reflective, contemplative practices. So my take, Trip, and I would love to hear what you think of this. I think that Finkenwalde really is the combination of monastic practices that Bonhoeffer is drawing from and youth ministry and like the wedding experience, the Mr. Wolf experience. Like there's this sense of a kind of, for lack of a better term, a kind of youth group feel to it. There's a lot of soccer played on the beach. There's a lot of listening to music and having conversations. And then there's a lot of demand is probably too strong, but pretty close. Pretty close to demand that you have to pray, that you have to find a confessor, that you have to meditate on scripture. Practices that classically Lutheran pastors or, young men who had been confirmed in Lutheran traditions and in Lutheran communities would not have been familiar with or comfortable with. And so it's an interesting kind of mix of that, kind of Luther's theology of the cross hanging on youth ministry practices that Bonhoeffer does and monasticism.
One of the ways I've found helpful at getting inside his head of what's going on in London is the letter he writes to Karl Barth about it, where I got the quote right here. He said, "If it is all desirable after such a decision to find well-defined reasons for it, I think one of the strongest was that I no longer felt inwardly equal to the questions and demands that I was facing." And he goes on describing how there are these other members of the confessing church that are like, Bonnie, you're a little radical here. You're being a little too aggressive. You're going to alienate everyone. And so he talks about feeling really alone. And so he ends towards the end of the letter, he says, "And so I thought it was about time to go into the wilderness for a spell and simply work as a pastor unobtrusively as possible." Now, Bonhoeffer's unobtrusively as possible is followed by being told that he's committing high treason and he needs to say nothing but universal affirmation of the Reich Church, to which he gets up and proceeds to preach a sermon on 1 Corinthians 13, where he reflects on the weakness and proceeds to mock Hitler, with semi-direct quotes and allusions to him as saying Christianity is everything Nietzsche got wrong about it. I mean, like, it is like total nerd trolling. What he means by a wilderness for a spell, is in many ways having those experiences that you named that ultimately take shape in Finkenwalde. Like, one of the elements is that ecumenical side, and something that I found difficult to communicate, even with 8 hours in the audio documentary, is that after World War I, what we think of as ecumenical today in America, right? Like, we never had state churches.
Yeah.
And so many of the different denominations when they first were in America before World War II were based not just on a denomination, but, these are these Scottish Reformed people over here. And so they were very ethnic churches as well. But when you think of post-World War I, these ecumenical relations are also relations among nations who just did World War. And we thought democracy was a solution to the 30 Years' War right after the Protestant Reformation. So it's like, WTF? And so that desire for ecumenical relations is really transgressive of nationalism in many ways, because it goes, part of our allegiance to Christ is actually allegiance to everyone that's baptized in. Within the German church, that means even Jewish people that are baptized, this is not an adiaphora about what you do with baptized Jewish people. They get the Eucharist and they can serve it, sorry, right? And he has that fight within the German church. But then ecumenically, he goes, well, how are we going to do this? You get, at Finale, when he gets up there and does his talk on peace, where he's just like throwing bows, nonviolent ones, of course, but of just going like, we have a task as a church. Like, under what circumstance are you baptized into a body where you get to kill the person? And he goes, I'm not sitting here taking a side like, you have to be a pacifist, or, we need to baptize our nations. I'm just telling you that your allegiance and your identity at baptism complicates all of it, and there's no easy solution. And so maybe ecumenical church, we should have a council and say that the German Christian church isn't even a part of us, because they have violated the integrity, right? So that ecumenical space for him, I see as going, the church who recognizes the lordship of Christ in Germany is so compromised to address the challenges we're facing. We need an allegiance greater than nation states. And the church has one if we have ears to hear, of sorts.
Right.
And I think that second side, you're right, with Bell, there's the ecumenical connections later become part of him, sharing information as a double agent and all that kind of stuff, and passing on information, like what happens if there's an assassination and we can have rework Germany. But he also facilitated Bonhoeffer traveling around and visiting different contemplative communities, intentional communities, engaging. The Anglican communion has a much more openness, obviously, to the Catholic forms of piety, prayer, and community, something that Bonhoeffer discovered his first visit with his brother to Rome in a bit of a shock. So I think he's having those experiences, and at the same time, Bell connects him with Gandhi, where it's like, well, what happens if these communities that are practicing the way of Jesus in the church, and then someone outside the church who's witnessing to the church on behalf of the way of Jesus, Gandhi, like you can see those two, like the ecumenical horizon and the intentional contemplative action of a community resonating with him when he comes back to Finkenwalde.
Yeah, I mean, I'd recommend to people just fairly, I think like in the last year or so, there's a biography on Bell that's really interesting, and because you get a kind of different angle into Bonhoeffer from Bell's experience in these years and at a lot of the ecumenical gatherings that Dietrich was at. And one of the most fascinating things that happens later on here is that it becomes British, a kind of a policy, in really, for the most part, Allied policy, that there's only one kind of German, that all Germans equal Nazis. And Bell opposes that because of this ecumenical experience. Like, he's known these Germans from very early on, from the early 1930s, who have been opposing the National Socialists, and thinks that this is a terrible, terrible policy, that a German equals a Nazi. But that is Churchill's policy. But you get a deep sense of about how Bonhoeffer actually interacts at these ecumenical gatherings. And there, of course, are German Christians there. And then the confessing church shows up. And it's some of the only times really, and people should analyze this more and write a dissertation on it, where Dietrich really resists being in the same room as certain people. I mean, I think for the most part, Bonhoeffer is really willing to bridge gaps and be present. But there are a few of those ecumenical experiences where he says, in his other confessing church colleagues, that they will not be in the same room as the German Christians. And I think that's a really fascinating kind of reality to think about how you play that out. When does resistance take a kind of form of exclusion in a statement of no, and when does that actually could become ideological to a point where it is counter to the gospel? I mean, those are really difficult kind of points of discernment.
And you can see that in the books that come out of the Finkenwalde years, right? Like we talked about recently, the Cost of Discipleship. And there, the moment you think of this historical moment, it's hard not to hear cheap grace elements basically going, so you think that celebrating the grace of God, it legitimates the cultural accommodation of the church to a death cult. He's like, the idea that faith would not generate in the one who receives the deep grace of God obedience to the actual way of the one that's redeemed him. Like whatever you think you're doing, you've now turned grace into a justification for the abandonment of Christ's lordship and the church's mission, right? And then at the beginning of Life Together, in that opening chapter on community, you see that same thing there, really reflecting on what he's trying to do at Finkenwalde, where he goes, look, if you understand the gospel correctly, then everything is pure gift. Like your identity is, and you can't perform it or earn it. And so that makes you, it makes you have a different relationship with religious communities. You are there on behalf of the gospel, empowered by the gospel to tend to the gospel. And that means you don't get to have contempt for other people or dehumanize them or anything, but you do get to be clear about what has been proclaimed to you in the Word of God, and to accommodate idolatry with the justification of grace is to already fail your commitment as a leader, right? As someone given the task of proclamation and sacramental ordinances. And so you can see kind of in both of those where he's trying to work it out in community, like where he's going, well, why in the world would an ecumenical conference end by going, we recognize the confessing church as a real part of the church, but we're a bit uncomfortable about telling the Nazis they aren't. Where he's like, yeah, but it is the church of Jesus. It's not the church. It's the church of the gospel. That is a different framing. And as someone whose recent book actually is thinking about this, how do you think that kind of like gospel or Christocentric framing changes the way Bonhoeffer seeking to address questions of justice, exclusion, and then what hospitality or community looks like when I think oftentimes, as you talked about in your most recent book, we take these topics that are important, but we don't analyze them before the gospel. We analyze them in kind of the way it's playing out in a culture without grace, with whatever your tribe's demand for purity running through it.
To connect those, and one of the things that's essential in Finkenwalde is that there's a deep theological commitment here, and it's a radical one. I think that we kind of gloss past too quickly, which is that Bonhoeffer really does fundamentally believe that Jesus Christ is alive and Jesus Christ is speaking. And so this becomes really at the core what Finkenwalde is about, is discernment. How do you discern the call of Jesus Christ? How do you hear that call and follow it? And this is, to connect these, this is where Luther's theology of the cross plays out, is that there is at play, if you have to discern this, there is a way to look at how this word comes to you. And I think Bonhoeffer would most definitely affirm that it comes, well, you would kind of reference this in the sermon just a few minutes ago, it comes underneath, it comes broken, it comes in suffering. It actually comes in a sense of a low anthropology. It comes in the confession of being the kind of creature who needs something outside you. You need a foreign righteousness to come to you. So I think one of the real temptations here for Bonhoeffer, that Bonhoeffer reminds us of, is that there is a kind of temptation even to feel like you're on the right side and be triumphalistic and to kind of perform even the right ideological perspective. But cheap grace for Bonhoeffer is grace as an idea. And so when we become human beings who are more committed to ideas than persons, and particularly broken persons who are yearning, persons who are in moments of suffering and longing, once we lose the kind of existential tone of what it means to seek for something outside of us to save us for that foreign righteousness that we don't have within us. That's why it's foreign. We don't have it within us. Until then, we get confused. And I think the real temptation throughout modernity, and even in this moment, maybe because of the way the algorithms work and the way social media works, is we really do conform to ideas more than we conform to persons. I think we talked about that in the podcast around that mysticism book, is that, we tend to see others as either, at some level, either our fans or our opponents in some way. Like they're either supporting what we think or they're in opposition to what we think. They're therefore really good or really bad, but it's not their concrete humanity and kind of their brokenness before God, their experiences of impossibility, their longing for some kind of salvation, something to save them that draws us to them. It's whether we can stomach their ideas or not. And I think that's a real temptation. This is why for Bonhoeffer, as we've said, as we said when we talked about the cost of discipleship, it really is the person. And that's why Finkenwalde has to be about persons and relationship. It has to be about prayer, and it has to be about meditation, because we have to discern the call of the living Jesus Christ to follow and respond to it now. So we need those practices, those classic Christian practices, to try to discern this. But we also need to stay up late and play music. Man, this is really playing into how you want to have this Bonhoeffer trip. But we need to be together and hear each other's stories and wrestle with these ideas. And as I understand it, thinking, well, not everyone agreed on all of this. I think everyone agreed, confessing church is what we have to do. But how really bad were the National Socialists? What was the future? Was really war right on around the horizon? There was a lot of debate, and there was always the temptation, as I understand it too, that you could go and get legal anytime you wanted, especially in kind of 36, that you could decide, I really would like pension and health insurance or whatever. I would like this. I would like my paycheck to come from the state. And, that's pretty good. I'd like to stay in the union or whatever. So all I have to do is as I understand it, you could go down and simply become legal in some way. That changes when the National Socialists feel humiliated. And we'll probably talk about that at the end. And then it becomes about shutting this down. But early on, as I understand it, the National Socialists were 5 little seminaries of 20 to 30 men. We're not all that concerned about that. We're thinking about world domination here, So there was always debates about that temptation, and I think Bonhoeffer had a sense that that to be a pastor now, to be in these confessing churches, you would always be wrestling with temptation. That you would have to have this humility, both this doggedness to seek for the living Jesus Christ, to hear His word follow, and this humility of, your own finitude, your own longings, your own fears, your own susceptibility to temptation.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, as someone who's spent a lot of time in theological education and obviously youth ministry, I did that quite a bit. Can you kind of contrast the Finkenwalde experience with what most people goes through their head about seminary, right? Even doing the class currently, one of the things that's fascinating is how many Bonhoeffer scholars talk about it, but they don't explain in what goes on at Finkenwalde. And so I've had multiple ministers go, so what was the different part? Was it just they lived together, or how did this work? So knowing how much leadership he was given, and he's kind of inventing this out of whole cloth from all these webs of experiences. how would you kind of like describe the Finkenwalde experience, what he's going for, and how it got played out in the day to day?
Yeah, well, especially, contrasting it to theological education now. I mean, I'm there. It's an interesting thing because I think one of the kind of conversations often around Bonhoeffer, one of the appeals is that people want to reproduce Finkenwalde. That they feel like, I want to do that. I want to do that in my youth group. I've had so many youth pastors who are like, Finkenwalde is kind of the idea of what I want, or at least we want to do a retreat that feels like Finkenwalde or something like that. And at one level, I think that that's really powerful and is worth trying. And at another level, I don't know if it's possible to kind of to follow this. I mean, it was a unique kind of situation at play, but I do think like our seminary experiences now are really radically different. I mean, I think our seminary experiences for the most part are much more, well, I mean, a different way, but much more like Bonhoeffer's experience and the university. They're much more tied to Schleiermacher's encyclopedia and how we think about guilds. I mean, there's a certain kind of dynamic here where, like, the education around a kind of guild-based thinking about certain content or information you need to master or know kind of falls away here. And I think one of the things that's really appealing is how spiritual practice becomes ingrained in the process of learning. I do think that we can romanticize it a bit. I think these men heard lectures. I think Bonhoeffer gave them like classic lectures, probably very similar lectures that he gave in the university. And it was no doubt that these students knew that their principal was a qualified habilitation holding university, guy. So it wasn't all kind of touchy-feely, which I think we have to guard against as Americans, because we're like, oh gosh, we love the whole kind of spirituality piece of it.
Have you seen the students' notes of his lecture series on the doctrine of God in early 20th century Protestant theology?
No,
Oh man, it is a nerd fest. Like I just when you say that, I just think like that is not what you should do at youth group. I tried, where I was like, I came up with three different like broad schools of modern theology. I'm like, well, here's the metaphysics that are going underneath this, and blah blah blah. And I was like, look, Bonhoeffer did it.
Well, before he goes to London, he does a discussion group with like kids who he's still connected with in some way, but are beyond confirmation age. And they like come to his parents' house in Grenwald, and the question they have to discuss is like, what's the Catholic Church? And as Protestants, how should we respond to it and think about it? Like, that's like the youth group, because it's like post-confirmation. I mean, if you're a Lutheran today, you have your youth group after, you've gone through confirmation, and that's what they do. They sit around in the Bonhoeffer family parlor and talk about what's the legacy of the Catholic Church and how should we think about it? And they had to like respond in a thesis. So I don't know, just early 20th century Germans were unique creatures, I think, in that way. So yeah, total nerd fest at that level.
When you think of the rhythms, life together, in many ways, a lot of Bonhoeffer scholars talk about it as kind of like the idealized expression of Finkenwalde. But also in lots of biographies, you get both these different stories from lots of students where, it moves from like community sharing deep spiritual rhythms. He picks up from visiting these different contemplative communities or monasteries and such. And then these deep practices of sharing and engagement, like unlike so many of our biblical studies classes, your homework's Lectio Divina, and you might have one passage for a month, things like that, all the way to, the more traditional academic side of stuff that happens there. But I mean, you hinted at it even earlier that people, I know Victoria Barnett said he's always had this like deep pietistic streak from his time as a child, right? Like the Moravian prayer book and
Horn Sisters,
but he's always had this other like deep joy of performance and art and high culture, where he's ready to pull out records from and play the Negro spirituals to jazz and stuff, along with, so the more I learned about it throughout the last year and a half or so working on this project, the more Finkenwalde, yes, is like a ecclesial experiment, but it's also like Bonhoeffer just dialing to 11 all of his favorite things because he doesn't really know what to do.
Absolutely. And that's why he has his whole library sent there and, his record player, obviously. And I think he has his, the piano sent there. It is in some sense, I guess, it'd be really fascinating to be able to interview everyone who was part of it. I think there's some people who are like, geez, it was just like you're saying, like full on 11 Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And it became a little bit too much. But there is a sense where he is so confident in himself in some ways that he's like, well, this is the stuff I like. So this is the stuff we're going to do, And I don't want to give the impression that it was purely narcissistic. I think he had a rationale to it. And I think he had a vision of what was needed for these pastors to be faithful. But yeah, I mean, I do think that there is a sense that it was born out of, his own kind of senses of passion, which I do think there's something to be learned pedagogically there. We worked so hard at having kind of curricula that we think meets all these objectives. But at the end of the day, all of our own transformation, those of us who've spent years in seminaries and we're students in seminaries, really what ultimately ends up transforming us, maybe not just seminaries, maybe all of our academic experience, is the passion of the professor in some ways, to wrestle with the topic and to deal with it in a way that makes it have some kind of existential purchase. And so at one level, this is like you said, I think really well, this is all Bonhoeffer's favorite things, and at another level, that becomes incredibly formative to such an extent that what the class wants to do to celebrate Dietrich's 30th birthday is go to Sweden as a class trip, because his own stories of traveling have been like the late night stories he's telling them about, like what's like to be in Harlem and what was it like to be in Barcelona. And I'm sure there were stories about Rome. Like all of those travels for them became really, they were infatuated by them and decided that they should do a trip together. So they do in 1937, they go to celebrate Dietrich's 30th birthday. They decide to go to Sweden for a trip. So there is a certain way that, I don't know, it's interesting to think about the kind of both the way it's all about Dietrich's personality and the way that also keeps from being a kind of narcissistic, oppressive reality, but opens up for other people and other persons to be able to have certain experiences, but all with a certain direction towards what's needed in the future to be faithful to the gospel. And I think that's a really interesting thing right now is we tend to think in theological education, what will help students be prepared for the future, but how we define what that future is really, I think, important. And I think we tend to define it as a hellscape of lost resources and relevance, So how are we going to create pastors who can go into very depleted environments and create resources to keep their churches alive? And that is not what Bonhoeffer is thinking. He's thinking, what does it mean to lead a community to faithfully proclaim and live inside and maybe even die for the gospel?
Mm. Yeah, and something you mentioned earlier that I think is important is choosing to go to a confessing church seminary and exist outside the traditional structure for the German church was a decision to forego a whole lot of benefits. Now, Andy, I'm not saying you've ever encountered this, but I've met at least one clergy member who has said something like, well, I know what the truth is for the gospel in this situation, but insert retirement plan, health care, and pragmatic concerns. I know I've felt this before. I know denomination leaders who go, I think this is what we're called to do, but we also are managing investments. Probably a lot of them are tied up in things that are probably undermining the gospel's integrity. And we have these institutions that our sense of self's tied to. And so, right. So like everyone that goes there is already made a kind of decision about how to exercise their vocation that just gets worse, right? This is, it's during the Finkenwalde years that the German remilitarizes, institutes the draft, which includes students from there, and all sorts of things. So knowing that kind of pressure situation and how it leveled up, one of the elements in that are these kind of like breakthroughs of deep community, right? So through the rest of his life, letters exchanged with students that were there after it closes, eventually even sending prayer requests about each other becomes outlawed,
Yeah.
right? So you can't even mention people that aren't a member of the German Christian Church in prayer request time, or
Mhm.
write their names down or send letters, and all this kind of stuff eventually gets there. So knowing all that comes out of it, like how did that rhythm facilitate the kind of friendships that had some semblance of sustenance for people going forward?
Yeah, well, I think I mean, what's really interesting to think about, and as at the core of it, I think might be the most radical piece of life together, which is this call to confess your sins to another human being. I mean, that is a kind of vulnerability, a being held by your fellow Christian person, your fellow Christian follower in a really significant way. And every youth pastor who's told me they want to make their youth group like life together, I always immediately ask how the confession of your sins to a fellow person is going to go. And don't know many people have tried it. But I wonder about that as being this kind of essential, I don't know what you would call it, root system, or it seeds a kind of communion, to bear each other's burdens by bearing each other's sinfulness. That you talk about like avoiding the eclipse of a la Charles Taylor, like avoiding the eclipse of sin, or even allowing sin to just be like ideological impurity or something, like sin is central. I mean, this is where Bonhoeffer is such a Lutheran theologian, such a Lutheran pastor, where he will just not turn away from sin as being a central dynamic. Now, where he's kind of outside of his Lutheran tradition, is he's making people confess their sins to one another, as well as meditate on scripture and things like that. That feels far too Catholic. But there is a sense where this is the way that we have to focus on sin as this dynamic that reminds us we need a foreign righteousness outside of us. So I don't know. I mean, it would be something to explore further, and particularly kind of reread those pieces in the book I Knew Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which not all of them are from students at Finkenwalde, but a good handful are, and to analyze those again. But it's moving to think about Bonhoeffer in New York in 39 and in his own prison cell in Toggle, praying for these students who are now on the front and dying, writing letters to their family and bringing consolation to them in the midst of that. I mean, it's really, quite a powerful kind of dynamic. So yeah, I mean, maybe that goes back to our own seminary experience. Trip is that, I hate to admit this, but like we don't, the people we went through the 3 years of the MDiv or the 2 years of the MA or whatever aren't people that you still remember to pray for, or you feel such a bond with one another going through these years together that in some sense your own identity is embedded within your relationships with them. Like that's what happens, I think, for these young men.
Mhm. Yeah, and I was one, like, kind of, when I went to Wake Forest University's Divinity School, it was at a time where each incoming class had 30 students and they were all full time, and 3/4 of your classes, you all take, you follow the same trajectory. And so the number of very close friends I have that went through that process is significant. Oddly enough, in undergrad, little Bonhoeffer inspiration, I did attempt to talk my small group into confessing their sins with each other.
How'd it go?
Well, one, I found out later that so they were leaving certain things off the list, and it created a certain kind of bitterness. But no, it did. I mean, there were very positive things to it.
Yeah.
And even when you ran confirmation for the 15 years I was in a vocational space to do that, I told each of the confirmation class, this is the day every week I will keep praying for you. So like, and I found, that's powerful, both to be thinking about where all these individuals are, and
Yeah.
it gives a context for checking in with them when you find out something's going on or whatever that is fractured, and the church is, and how inept it is in large places of finding community for a lot of these students if they don't end up in the right neighborhood in the right city for a community anywhere near like the one they had. Those relationships can be sustaining when there's not a institutionalized expression for them. When I hear what a lot of churches do or have said to them or treated them, it does not make me optimistic about learning. Yeah. So this is also the period where he meets Eberhard Bethge, who, not just his biographer, closest friend. Kind of tell us that story. Like, what was their relationship, and what do you learn about Bonhoeffer by getting to know such a close friend?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is fascinating is he leaves London, and therefore leaves, really, I think it's fair to say, his closest friend. And I don't know, people may disagree with this, but I kind of seen Bonhoeffer as the kind of person who doesn't have a lot of friends. And I don't mean that like he's an outcast, but I mean that in the sense that he's so interconnected with his family and, his brother-in-laws and really the kind of that neighborhood, because you think, that the Valdahanis live on that street, and they all are kind of intermarried across that Grenwald neighborhood. That really is his place, is really his family. So people who are outside of that, Dietrich, I don't know. I mean, he has friends here and there, and but we don't get a ton of it. But Franz Hildebrand becomes such a close friend, and they become the kind of young ones in that Pastors Emergence League that are pushing things, and I think get exhausted because they're the two that are trying to push the church to go further than the Pastors Emergence League to go further than they're ready to. But he ends up in London with Franz Hildebrand, and so when he leaves London, he's leaving Hildebrand. Pretty quickly meets Eberhard Bethge. And as I understand that story goes, is that Bethge says that he comes late for some reason, like they've gathered. He's missed, for lack of a better term, he's missed orientation week, So one of my favorite, I can't remember what documentary it is, but Eberhard talks about this, and he says, he came late, and they were all down on the beach playing soccer, and he had no idea who the principal was, who was the president of this seminary. And then somebody pointed it out to him, and he's like, in his German accent, he's like, "Oh, that sporty one." So you get the impression that Dietrich's down there just dominating them in soccer and in football, and which kind of fits the Paul Lehmann assertions too, that Bonhoeffer is pretty sure of himself and probably pretty good at sport, as they would say, great tennis player. And so that starts that relationship. And really, as I understand it, like their friendship really builds around these classic Christian practices, and that Eberhard becomes his confessor. So they confess each other's sins to one another. And so they become very close through that process of him being his confessor, which is another really interesting dynamic, is that, thinking about, I don't know, kind of power structures there, or thinking about how one leads others into spiritual practices. It's really clear that they find this to be unusual, but they also are asked to do it, and they're told they don't have a choice to do it. Like, you either do it or you go to one of the other seminaries, or you go back to the university or whatever. But they're not asked to do something that Dietrich himself won't do. And I think that's an important piece of leadership here. So these long meditations on scripture isn't, Dietrich's in his office working on his own stuff, or, playing the piano while they're out there meditating on scripture. He is too. And if one of the most difficult things is to confess your sins to someone, then he has a confessor too. And that's where kind of Eberhard comes in at that point, as I understand it, that they come in. And I think, he's Eberhard has connections through his father to the kind of confessing church and things like that. And so yeah, that's where as I understand, the relationship really kicks off. But it starts in this joining in this practice of carrying each other's burdens by being each other's confessor.
Yeah, and one of the things that helps make sense of is, they end up with a joint bank account. They
Yeah.
send Christmas gifts and cards together. Their friendship becomes one. And I mean, it's very similar to Sam and Frodo of this. What starts out with a power dynamic, like Sam's the gardener of Frodo, or this is his student,
Yeah.
ends with a deep reciprocity,
Yeah.
where the other one's story can't be told without the other.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think that when we think of Bonhoeffer, even from early on, like the recognition that Christ exists in
Yeah.
in the other and in these relationships, the kind of closeness he has with the family, it's ultimately like Hildebrand Bethge, a few friends, where he realizes that kind of deep relationship, friendship, and intimacy is possible in these other
Yeah.
contexts. Something that you kind of wonder whether it would have happened elsewhere if Sabine hadn't gotten married, which is his twin sister, by the way, for those that
Right. You should all know the inside lingo by now of where all these people fit. But the other thing to remember is he's the youngest. I mean, he's the youngest boy. He's part of the younger ones. So yeah, I mean, there is something really fascinating about that. There's really kind of never a time where he isn't. Maybe some of his travels, like when he goes, when he maybe only when he really goes to Barcelona. I mean, for the most part, he's always has this kind of deep connection. New York, maybe it starts that way, but he ends up with these deep connections and these deep friends with Erwin Schutz
Frank
and Paul Lane
Frank Fisher.
and yeah, and Frank L. Fisher and those kind of people end up a deep community for him. But maybe, a sense in the first few months that he's alone. But even there, he's got like family in Philadelphia, that he visits early on. And so he always is deeply interconnected. And so, yeah, to share these kind of material and even structural connections with Eberhard going forward kind of makes sense to him. He's from a big family. It's a very interconnected family. And I don't think Dietrich has any desire to see himself outside of being bound to others in community, so he always wants to see himself in some ways in and through those relationships most primarily. And those also in an odd way give him his confidence to be his differentiated self, to be able to be quite bold and speak out of those realities. So it's always one of my biggest pet peeves reading Bonhoeffer scholarship is like talking about his ethics or whatever, to not realize how his own ethics is embedded in these deep relationships he has. Like he's willing to do what he needs to do for Hans and for Eberhard and for his sister and for his sister's husbands and children. Like those are all why there's risk necessary for the persons that you're called to. And it's a very deep sense of, again, this Lutheran move of God alone is the justifying actor here. But that action of being justified sends you out to care for your neighbor and even be willing to die for your neighbor in the name of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I'm remembering a story, and I'm thinking this is in Charles Marsh's biography, where his sister, who's married to ethnically Jewish man and kids, that Dietrich and Eberhard are joining them on their escape when they're escaping the country. And her reflections on it, she'd kind of been anticipating it, but they aren't going to be told they're kids and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they get in the car, and she remembers Dietrich and Eberhard switching seats, so they got to sit there and talk with each of the kids. And the kind of like, you can see them just singing with them and trying to sustain them all the way to the border. And they get out and they walk over and wave bye. And that was her last memory as a kid of her uncle. But that, like, even in that scene, like, his close friend Bethge sitting there and is intimately involved in his family, and his family understands it because, like, they understand the kind of close knitness of family. He and Bethge share the same thing of being there when Martin Niemöller's family, or ultimately, where the police show up and go through the house, find the money behind the painting from the Pastors Emergency League, which was one of the other things that got outlawed that set up the eventual shut down of the seminary. Not only could you not pray for people by name that aren't members of the church, can't reproduce anything or share stuff and put it in writing. You also can't even meet the needs. You can't do collections to meet needs of people, because if the needs aren't being met by the state, they are non-persons to the state, right? And so
Yeah.
Niemöller has all this money hidden back that is connected to supporting people that, have been excommunicated essentially from society, and that's the ultimate charge that gets him sent to a concentration camp.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is interesting to think about, and that Niemöller's associate pastor, as I understand it, is Franz Hildebrandt, and so I mean, so Dietrich is pretty close to Niemöller, but mainly through Hildebrandt. But then you think, here's Hildebrandt and Bonhoeffer, these young pastors trying to push these older pastors to be more radical, to take more radical steps, to see that this isn't just a kind of ecclesial structural issue, like keep the National Socialists out, but it's a major existential issue. So yeah, it is fascinating to think about how that all plays itself out.
Once the seminary shut down, and then you get this kind of deep isolation running through him, especially when he ultimately is, in prison. And there he returns to a lot of the themes about what the church could look like. But it's after even the failure of the confessing church, where, he felt this whole situation of joining the conspiracy and then thinking about the whole vicarious representative action and all that thing. But I'm interested in what do you see as the elements of continuity and transformation when in, say, ethics and the letters and papers, where he comes back to thinking about the future of the church, right? Where he's postulates in their way, they might not own property, definitely may not have clergy getting paid. We got to rework how we talk about the whole thing, religionless Christianity, all that kind of stuff. And yet it's obvious that he thinks the transformations for what faith looks like in a world come of age is a different makeup than he even imagined before. But there are also these threads of continuity, arcane disciplines, the intimacy of things like confession and such. As someone who's wrestled with Bonhoeffer and as a practical theologian thinking about questions of ecclesiology in the present, are there particular threads that we should take seriously, wrestle with, think again, especially as people now are even thinking again about, like, what's the faithful church look like in the midst of a whole bunch of crises?
Well, I think the red thread throughout, really all the way back to 25, 27, in the writing of Sanctorum Communio, is the dogged commitment to explore, to push into the concreteness of revelation. How is it in our concrete lives that Jesus Christ shows up? Where is Jesus Christ in our midst? And that, for Bonhoeffer, never, I think, wavers from having a deeply social dynamic to it, a deeply relational dynamic, that it happens in the relationality of persons in relationship is where it happens. I don't think that ever leaves him, that commitment that's there. And I think, we do forget one of the core relationships at Finkenwalde is not only Eberhard, like that's the one that gets all the press. But we forget that it's also Ruth, who is one of this woman, Rister, I'm forgetting your name. Ruth, anyhow, you can look it up in my book. Do you remember what it is?
No, but she's the one that ends up in many ways supporting, sustaining financially.
She was the major funder, but she loves Dietrich Ritzvau, I think she's got a hyphenated name. But what happens after the seminary closes in 37 is Dietrich stays in that area, and basically all the students go into congregations, and he's then sending circular letters of text to meditate on, of write-ups, of kind of like mini lectures, basically. And he's staying at Ruth's. He's either in Berlin at his parents' house, which we'll have a class at, or he's at Ruth's estate, like staying in at her place. And they have long conversations. There's a certain kind of mutuality of discussion that's going on there. So even in those moments, he has this sense of persons in relationship is where we're faithful to God, and the necessity to be attentive to really the burdens and the joys and the life that people are living, and the communities they're connected to. So he becomes this is Ruth, where some people know this. It's Ruth's granddaughter, who Dietrich ends up engaged to, Maria von Wedemeyer. And Maria, he ends up catechizing and taking through confirmation Ruth's grandchildren, and Maria's too young, and Dietrich doesn't allow her to do it. That's the first time he meets her, and then they'll meet again some six years later, when she's older, and then start a relationship. But that's a really important piece for Bonhoeffer, is these being connected to persons. And it's partly his disposition, it's partly his background, but it also is his theological commitment that Jesus Christ is always found in community, and in communities where persons are free but bound to one another.
I don't know if you've gotten this message yet, but I've gotten it quite a few times, being in the middle of a big class on Bonhoeffer. And then after the election, the number of people, anytime there's some big thing in the life of the church, it's like, oh, it's a Bonhoeffer moment, or what would Bonhoeffer do? And all that kind of thing. Now, hopefully doing the documentary will help people at least have a better idea of who he is. But when you think of the struggle for integrity that he had in a deeply disturbing period of his own church and country's life, what out of that is something to be gleaned for people that are feeling similar things in the present?
Yeah, and this maybe takes us back right to our last question, which I think Bonhoeffer might even tell us that, first of all, this will be deeply confusing. And if you think it won't be confusing, then you're not really in reality. I do think it's so clear to us. The popular historian Tom Holland has said this, and I think he's really right about it, is that the reality of the Nazis, and even the kind of conception of the Nazis, has become really the only overarching moral tale we have anymore in the West. In other words, like, all the other ones have been either deconstructed or secularized. We don't have stories of devils, and we don't have kind of poignant kind of stories of apocalypse and other kind of forms of even evil. In some sense, we've even kind of disenchanted evil as a reality. But the Nazi becomes the kind of paradigmatic parable of evil that still exists for us. So at that level, it seems really, really clear. But something that's hard to get your mind around, that I think makes Bonhoeffer really quite beautiful, but also should remind us that he's a human being, is that everyone who's in this struggle, even all these men who are going to Finkenwalde, they don't necessarily know that Nazis are Nazis yet. You know what I mean? Like, they're getting some pretty good clues, and this is why they've gone there, but they don't know where this is all leading. They're right in the middle of this. And that makes it really quite confusing, and trying to figure this out. And I think what Bonhoeffer would then remind us is, whatever the moment calls for, and there will be more moments where it gets deeply, deeply confusing and calls for distinct forms of action, is that you can't act to be on the side of, or have it figured out beforehand, that this is the right action, that this is the innocent action, that this is the justified action. I think what we have to remember about Bonhoeffer's story is that he acts even feeling like he's disobedient, feeling like it's not justified, the action that he's taken. It is faithful, but it's only faithful because he thinks the living Jesus Christ is calling him into it. And it costs him that. So I think what he would remind us is twofold. Whatever the future calls for, we have to think distinctly as a church of, where is the revelation of Jesus Christ? How concretely do we hear the call of Jesus Christ? How do we participate in the life of Jesus Christ? And that will have some dynamic, some real dynamic of being persons in relationship, of being in communion. And that will mean we can bear each other's suffering, but also that we can celebrate with each other and have joy. That no matter how bleak it gets, there still is this call to live and to laugh and to celebrate. The Bonhoeffer family never stopped that. Dietrich and Finkenwalde, preparing men, he really thought some of these men will have a gun to their head. I mean, this is essentially how he preaches the confirmation sermon for Ruth's grandkids, is that, like, it's Mark 9, and I believe, help my unbelief. Like, you could have there are bleak days. There could be a gun to your head. But in community, even that heaviness shouldn't replace the celebration of what it means to laugh and live together. And so the focus on this kind of Christological center that always is lived out concretely in community is, I think, essential for us. Whatever Bonhoeffer moment that we're in, or if we're in, to truly, I think, follow the lead of Bonhoeffer, it is this kind of this Christological, but in some sense, I don't mean that doctrinally. I mean almost this confessional sense that Jesus Christ is living and calling, and is the word that calls us to act obediently, that calls us to follow, and that will somehow be discerned inside the deep love and ability and willingness to suffer for those in your life.
Yeah, and I think that Christological centering for Bonhoeffer is different than the doctrine of Christology. It's not sitting around discussing the person and work. It's more like the Christ event in these contexts of deep pressure it's an event. So then out of the Christ event, you resist cynicism, despite its temptation. You resist inaction, though it may be easy. You resist hopelessness because there's no point in history that's ultimately excluded from God's horizon. And for Bonhoeffer, that even includes resisting contempt for people that you see bundled up in the energies claiming people in culture and society for demonic ends. And that is countercultural to so many expressions of resistance that aren't, in some sense, subject to the gospel, with the tendency towards cynicism, either inaction or burn it down. It is a kind of a hopelessness and nihilism and meaninglessness is sitting there. And then you render to your neighbor some ideological closure where you become self-righteous by judging them rather than recognizing your affirmation and equality below the cross. And I think that is something that there aren't a lot of spaces in our own context where that form of resistance can empower and enable community and such. And it's something I think in America you see preserved in a lot of the Black church, the place that Dietrich even first experienced it, when he goes, well, I was a theologian and now I'm Christian, or the phraseological has found purchase and those kind of transitions.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said. And you do remember, you have to remember at Finkenwalde, there they are, late at night, laughing, talking, listening to good music, drinking good wine, that when you're facing this apocalyptic reality, you also have to live. You have to resist by living and loving and laughing and while you cry and grieve and while you fear.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been fun talking with you, Andy. Thank you all of you for listening. If you got all the way here and you want to hang out this summer, go to bonhoeffertrip.com. True with one P, not like my name, with two. And the second P.
It should be with two P's. That would be some classic branding.
Yeah, also a bit vain.
Feel like it would be a bit towards narcissism.
Yeah, there's Bonhoeffer, and then there's like the dude that had a podcast.
Yeah. Who knows what the future will call Trip and how the podcast will need to be used.
Yeah. There you go. Your affirmation is only rivaled by my mother. Thank you, Andy.
We hope to see some of you on the trip. We hope you can make it happen.
All right. Bye, friends. Hey, you made it all the way through the episode. Congratulations. If you would like to help make this possible, I would absolutely love for you to head over to homebrewedcommunity.com. There, you'll be able to join the Substack community, process this, where you get ad-free versions of all the new episodes when they come out. You'll be able to get invites to live engagement, Zoom hangouts and such. And it's a real easy way to help make this happen. Or you could join theologyclass.com. That is a place where you get access to the 45 plus online classes we've done, and we keep adding to it. I'm just saying, there are lots of ways to support the podcast, get access to extra content and interaction, and I deeply, deeply, deeply appreciate all of you who've helped make this part. So head over homebrewedcommunity.com and share the brew. Smoochy boochies, friends.